Alright, well I'm going to be talking about some of the ideas that Charles Kos has put forward, and you've probably never heard of the gentleman, but there's lots of people who talk about ancient civilisations and what they're up to. And for no particular reason I thought I'd pick on him as like someone to disagree with. So what he actually talks about, one of his claims is that the lines in the Bible where they talk about God taking a rib from Adam and putting it in Eve to make that was basically genetic engineering that the ancients did, because there's 46 chromosomes and there's something like 24 ribs. Of course, you double the number of ribs, and I think that actually means you've got 48 rather than 46 chromosomes that we actually have. But never mind, he says that basically the ancients were doing this genetic engineering, and they were operating from earlier texts that they were translating, and so they got this this thing of like genetic manipulation with the chromosomes. But the interesting thing is somehow they managed to pick up chromosomal level genetic manipulation, but they didn't pick up the germs theory of disease, or the fact that the sun sits in the centre of the solar system and the earth rotates around it, right? So it's bizarre that the Bible picked up that thing supposedly, but not much more basic medical knowledge. And in fact, it's not really clear what bloody benefit, you know, having these chromosomes and just knowing that there's this many chromosomes gives you. It's not really clear either. Now, the other thing that Charles also says, he talks about Stonehenge, and if you go and look at Stonehenge, there's some really old rocks and there's some more new rocks. And he says that this is evidence for like some sort of ancient technology, that the rocks wear differently. But if you actually go into history, I don't know when it was, probably a good 80 or so years ago, Stonehenge back then was a lot more dodgy than it is now, and they actually reconstructed it with modern lumps of rock, right? People don't know this, but the Stonehenge we see is not Stonehenge in some sense.
The original.
It's not the original Stonehenge. You can actually find original pictures of Stonehenge, and I don't know what you would estimate, but probably only a sixth of the stones that you have there were in the original Stonehenge of like 80 odd years ago. And so Mr. Kos is talking about this. Now, one of the things that Charles Kos did actually tell me about, which was quite intriguing, was that there was this computer for doing you know, divination that the Muslims came up with. And that was looked like a moderately complicated gadget that the Muslims came up with, but that's not really news. There were some pretty fancy, you know, mechanical gadgets back then, and this was just a cute one that actually survived. Because one of the things about brass was really scarce. So a lot of brass got melted down. And basically what that means is we've got a bucket load of marble statues, because it's really hard to repurpose marble, okay? You make a marble statue and you think, oh, we might as well leave that. But you've got this bunch of brass and you think, wow, that's valuable, we can do other things like that. So if you inherit someone's brass statue, rather than thinking of having it sit there and look ornamental, you think about how much can I flog this for or melt it down for. And what that means is that while the ancients did have brass statues, I think there's some ridiculous ratio, like there's 100 more marble statues that have survived to current day as compared to a much more minuscule proportion of brass statues. Right, so the point is that there could well have been a lot of brass instruments, and when they broke down they didn't repair them, they melted them down and turned them into something else. So, well, there you go. But the other thing is, if you go back far enough, I mean, what do we have in history? We know about the Neolithic Revolution. We know that they did agriculture at the Neolithic Revolution about 10,000 years ago. Because Neolithic means new stone or polished stone, but not only were they fancy with their stone, they also got into agriculture and formed settled communities. And that happened about 10,000 years ago. And basically, while it's a bit dull and monotonous to say it, you can actually trace human history from the Neolithic Revolution 10,000 years ago to modern civilization with a reasonably linear track. You can tell that that the written language actually emerged twice on Earth. All the written language throughout Europe comes from some source in the Mediterranean. The second alternative was the Mayans and the Incas in America, right? So basically two spots where the written language developed. There's only one spot on planet Earth where coinage was developed, and coinage spread all throughout the world from that one location. We've got a bucket load of coins around, you know, lots of them with Roman emperors on them, and there's something that happened 5 times in the world, 5 times in ancient history. There were cities that developed for the first time. Because the interesting thing that you find out about the first cities are actually open plan without defensive perimeters, right? Because the way I articulate it is, yes, there was wars and conflict, but before you get wars and conflict, you have to have something to fight over. Once there's wealth there to fight over, then you get wars. So while you would have minor skirmishes and so on, basically the first cities were made in a time of peace. So they didn't actually have defences. It was a later development when this conflict developed that you actually developed cities that had defences. So the first 5 cities in the world, happened 5 separate times, were actually open plan without defences. But basically that is what you might call the conventional story of history. And you know, it does make sense. There really aren't any missing bits to it. The ancient Egyptians did some pretty impressive things, building the pyramids and so on. You know, the people who built Stonehenge did some impressive things, but they were moving around lumps of rock. They didn't have electronic technology, they didn't have levitation, they didn't have a whole heap of things. They were just pretty good at moving rocks around and fashioning them, right? So you don't need to actually posit any sort of grand lost advanced civilizations. And